Hello everybody. Say hello to Lexi. Lexi was my mom's cat. We inherited Lexi when my mom passed away. And we never, we had no prediction about how that would work out for Lexi. She's been kind of a princess for 10, 11 years. Her own cat, her own home, everything has been hers. And then we bring her to this crazy house here of cats. And she's doing well. Yeah, Lexi. So, and you can see she's not starving to death by any means. She's actually lost about 2 pounds since she's been here. She gets a good stair workout and she eats plenty, that's for sure. So she's not losing weight because of that. So we returned to our conversation. We discussed reliability. Let's review it. What is reliability? Hey, does a measure assess, does it deliver a score that's similar to a previous score if the measure was used twice? So we want to determine reliability, test, retest reliability, what have you. We want to make sure that our testing scenarios are identical, as close to identical as possible, so that our candidates are getting the exact same experience through the process, thus enhancing reliability. So reliability is core. Without reliability, you might as well not bother with the measure at all. Right? Now, validity, on the other hand, is the question, the secondary question, are we actually measuring what we intend to measure? And this you can see when we're selecting measures to assess our candidates. Are we selecting something that in some way predicts their on-the-job performance? That is the measure valid to our purpose? Or is it relatively meaningless? And we can see that a lot of personality or trait type measures might fall into this category. Sure, the Big Five is reliable. I've taken 2 versions of the Big Five. I've taken the real honest-to-God Big Five, and I've also taken an online version of the Big Five, and guess what? My personality traits are relatively fixed, and the measure assesses them reliably. But do my scores on the Big Five predict how I will function on a job? Well, that's a different issue, and that's really the issue of validity. So validity then, right, refers to how well a measure assesses a given construct and the degree to which you can make specific conclusions or predictions based on observed scores. Let's take an example. Let's suppose you only have time to give one measure and you want to predict college performance. Which measure would be more valid? The SAT score or grade point average? And what we find is that the grade point average in high school is a better predictor of performance in college, typically, than the SAT is. Now, there are exceptions, and I mean, that's different for different people, but all in all, the grade point average as an attainment, as a measure of actual attainment, is probably the better bet. SAT, in fact, measures abilities, but not necessarily performance. So that's, and you know, for those of us who, let's say, had high SAT scores but low grade point average, and I'm not mentioning any names here, but colleges look at that and say, wow, kid's got real high SAT scores, has a lot of potential, right, has the ability to learn, etc., but their grade point average sure doesn't conform to their potential. And that makes you that makes a candidate for college admission makes it very low potential, because they say, why is this person underperforming? And we've often heard the term underachiever. So that would be the comparison of 2 measures. But validity-wise, I think grade point average is a better predictor of college success than SAT would be. And let's use that term, all else being equal, that is factoring anything out of the discussion or argument. So validity will tell you how useful a measure is for a particular situation. Reliability will tell you how consistent the scores are for that measure. So that's the difference. You can't draw valid conclusions unless you're sure the measure is reliable. So that's why I keep saying that reliability is at the pinnacle of importance. Right? So you may be able to measure a person's shoe size reliably, but it may not be useful as a predictor of job performance, right? And back to the measurement, especially when we're talking physical measurements, if you're going to measure someone's shoe size, how many times do you measure it? Yeah, if you're an engineer, you measure it 3 times and you take the average of those 3 measures as the most reliable measure. Any measure in staffing needs to be both reliable and valid for the situation. But remember, reliability comes first, validity comes next. So let's take an example here, and if anyone engages in shooting in a hobby, then this measure will make a lot of sense to you. I mean, this example will make a lot of sense to you right off the bat. See, the first one up here, where it looks like it was shot maybe with a shotgun, or at least what we conceive as a shotgun, it's not reliable, nor is it valid. That is, the shots are all over the place, and we can't tell where the point of aim was. And the point of aim would be what we're attempting to measure and how we're going to measure it, right? Now, this is fairly valid, but not reliable. If the center represents the ability of our construct, our measure, to predict performance in the area, we can see that, well, so, yeah, some of it is working, but we would really like to tighten up the spread. That has increased the reliability. Now, in this, we have a nice tight pattern, so the questions are hanging together well, so to speak. The shots are hanging well together. It's reliable, but it's off target. It's not measuring what we want. So when a measure is both reliable and valid, then we see that, in fact, we get a nice tight grouping, and it's centered at the aim point. And that's what we're hoping for, is a nice reliable measure that's consistent number of shots there, right? Consistent in their grouping, and centered on where we want it to be. So kind of just a visual kind of analysis there. Now, a term that you might have heard before, or you can hear it now, is called face validity. Annika's helping us out here, huh? What do you think, Annika? You're such a pretty girl. You're so affectionate. Okay. So face validity is subject assessment of how well the items seem to be related to the requirements of the job. And that's it. We take it at its face. So we might look at a questionnaire and say, on its face, it appears to be assessing what we're interested in the job. Face validity often important to job applicants, because job applicants, you know, they're not going to delve into the nature of the measure you used and then dig up the research and look at actual construct validity arguments, etc., and assessment. On its face, it seems like this is fairly trying to assess what you're going to want me to do, right? So if they are engaging in a measure that doesn't seem to be related to what it is they're going to do, then they say on its face, this doesn't seem like a valid test. And I'll go back to the example I used in the last module, when they were giving us the problems to solve, and I'm hiring for a job as a forklift driver, and they're giving us all these esoteric problems to solve about this baseball team and who played what and did all this other stuff. I'm like, what the hell does this have to do with driving a forklift? So in that case, reliable or not, I don't know. I don't have the data on the assessment they were using, but it didn't seem like a valid assessment, right? And what it turned out to be, Linda Baller, one of the supervisors at the mill who was in part operating the assessment, she said, yeah, I don't understand. This is a conversation we had 2 years after the hiring date. She said that was to assess leadership, and I said, well, that makes sense then. If it was to assess leadership, I can understand in reflecting on what we were doing. But what is the hell does that have to do with a forklift driving job? And she said, nothing. And she said, and the big problem was, so we hired the 15 people out of the 60, right, who demonstrate highest leadership skill or potential, take your pick, in that, to drive forklifts in a union environment. And this is where they had a problem, because of the 15 of us that were hired, within 2 years, 5 had left, right? Because there's really no potential for advancement, no place. So you're hiring leaders, but you're hiring them into a position that really doesn't, in fact, fill one's need to lead, so people are likely to look for other jobs. So a lot of times it doesn't pay to put the bar too high. I want to hire these stellar people with all these amazing qualities that maybe not are necessary to run the French fry machine at McDonald's. So this is why we've gone to such lengths to look at job analysis and translate that into person specifications. And this is really the story of developing valid measures. We need to know what it is the person will do, and then we can begin to figure out how to measure that with some level of validity. So even if a measure seems to have face validity, if it doesn't predict job performance, then it shouldn't be used. So this again then goes back to our longitudinal system. We look at applicants, we rank order them on the basis of our measures, but then that's just the beginning of the job. The rest of the job is tracking their performance over time, and ultimately, years down the road, 6 months down the road, a year down the road, 2 years down the road, longitudinal analysis, did that measure predict their on-the-job performance? And that is going to be the story of validity or lack of validity. Okay? So face validity, the simple thing is you read a measure and you say, this appears that this measure would assess blank, right? Okay. So, for example, if I ask a question, this is a question on the MMPI, have you ever stolen anything? Or I guess in the MMPI it's a yes/no. So I've never stolen anything in my life. Well, to what extent the face validity is looking at a person's honesty. We can kind of just face validity that right off the bat. Now, deficiency, contamination, and relevance, kind of a little higher order constructs surrounding this. The theoretical criterion is a perfect world representation of a construct. So you might hold up, like in your example when you're doing the repertory grid for teachers, you might say, hey, man, clarity. So, but what does that mean? That's perfect world. It's rare that we can achieve absolute clarity. So clarity becomes a relative concept. The actual criterion is what the measure actually measures. So the way in which we measure clarity is going to be actual. Clarity is theoretical, and there's going to be some distance between what we actually measure and the theoretical construct. So we're always going to fall a tad short, right? To the extent that the actual captures the theoretical, that's the level of relevance. So you can see that some measures will be more relevant to the theoretical construct, some will be less relevant. Important to just understand that there is not a perfect world, and our measures will never perfectly capture the theoretical construct. The difference is the level of relevance, right? Now, to the extent the measure fails to capture the theoretical, then the measurement demonstrates deficiency, and that's why we have this Venn diagram, right? So you can see the deficiency is what the measure fails to measure. Now, to the extent the measure captures that which is not relevant, that is the level of contamination. Contamination being this is measuring something that we don't need to measure, is not intended to measure, is not part of our theoretical construct. So measures suffer from their ability to measure a construct fully, and that's going to be the deficiency, and measures often measure areas that are not relevant to the theoretical construct. They're measuring something else as well, and in that case that represents contamination. So we want to, of course, then just diminish contamination, and we want to diminish deficiency and find a measure that best captures what the theoretical construct. So we go through a process of what's called validation. It's a cumulative ongoing process of establishing the job relatedness of a measure. So we give the measure, we have some performance criteria in mind, hopefully from the very beginning, and we're able to assess applicants after we hire them and determine how well our measure predicted their success. So we can do three different types here. Construct-related validation is demonstrating that a measure assesses the construct or characteristic it claims to measure. If we say we're measuring extroversion, do we actually measure extroversion, right? The content-related validation demonstrates the content of a measure assesses important job-related behaviors. And then criterion-related validation demonstrating there's a statistical relationship between scores from a measure and some aspect of job success. So we're going to we would look at all three of these if we're going to effectively use measure. Notice criterion is operationalizing it, turning it to numbers, and essentially doing some form of correlational research. To what extent did my score on this measure predict my success as it was supposed to? So we can look at validity coefficients. It's a number between 0 and 1 that indicates the magnitude of the relationship between the predictor, test scores, and the criterion such as job performance or job success. So this in fact is like a correlation coefficient, although it's slightly calculated differently. That is the validity coefficient, the absolute value of the correlation between the predictor and the criterion. Now notice that correlation scores, when we assess correlation, it can be a negative relationship or it can be a positive relationship, and then the number indicates the strength. When we look at a validity coefficient, that is, then we strip away the negative or positive aspect and just look at the strength of the correlation. Validity coefficients rarely exceed 0.4 in staffing contexts. That is, they just aren't all that, you know, and a bag of Doritos. They get close, and then we look at it, relatively speaking. That is, we can assess measures as being more or less valid. And again, as we go back just a slide or two, none is going to be an absolute perfect capture of the theoretical construct. So validity coefficients then, just to give you a ballpark idea, hey, below 0.11, then it's unlikely to be useful. So if you're using the when you're doing the find and measure paper, then you may look at the research on that measure, if it has been researched, and that's part of the deal, right, is to determine has it been researched. If it provides you a validity coefficient, then mention it in the assignment, and you talk then about how useful, or in this term, well, useful or beneficial, right? And the higher the number, then the more benefit there is from using that measure. Again, there's a zillion measures out there. So these numbers, this data, this analysis allows us to choose measures that are most closely linked to what we want to see in terms of on-the-job performance. To use measures that are invalid then is really a waste of time, as it is to use measures that are unreliable would be even maybe a bigger waste of time, if you will. So evaluating the validity coefficient, consider then a couple things that we have to return to previous course concepts. Does this measure create adverse impact? And of course, stringent testing helps us determine this. And then we've got to collect demographic information and use that as part of our analysis. Right? The number of applicants compared to the number of openings. Right? So to what extent... Annika, what are you doing? So the number of applicants compared to the number of openings, the number of currently successful employees. So these are all things that we want to track and build into our analysis of the measure. Right? What's the cost of a hiring error? This is something we have to consider as well. If the cost of a hiring error is extremely high, then we really have to double down on our ability to demonstrate the validity of the measure and the reliability of the measure. And this is kind of a pros and cons analysis or priority. If you're hiring for many different positions, but the impact of a poor hire in certain positions is relatively low, then you probably don't need to devote as much time to assessing reliability and validity of your measure. But if it's a hugely important kind of position where consequences of a poor hire can be significant, then you really want to pay greater and greater attention to your statistical analysis and your vetting, your research on these measures. What is the cost of the selection tool? Some tools, they might be just too expensive to purchase or too expensive to use, and kind of takes them out of the running. There's always trade-offs, right? In a perfect world, we would use the absolute best measures regardless of the time and cost, but for certain positions that might not make sense. Doesn't that kind of blow your mind that we elect instead of hire a president? When you look at this, what's the cost of a bad hire when it comes to in terms of president? Well, the costs are substantial. I mean, it could be nuclear obliteration if you want to blow it up to that level. And yet, what do? We run a popularity contest. So that's just silly, right? So the probability of hiring a qualified applicant without using a scoring assessment tool, that is, could we in fact hire an applicant who will be a high quality applicant without bothering with any of this nonsense? And my knee-jerk reaction to that is no, we got to use proper assessment tools. So validity, not enough though. Applicants' a valid assessment system can result in adverse impact by differentially selecting people from various protected groups, can have low face validity and result in lawsuits. So if people can't see why you're using this measure and it's not well supported, right, and it does create adverse impact on groups, and people can demonstrate this, then you've opened yourself up for lawsuits, right? The organization's time and cost, valid assessment system can have unacceptably long time. And hiring, managers and departments say, I need someone hired now, not 6 months from now. So you'll be operating under those kind of constraints, right? Further, future recruits, it can be valid, but if the system is too long or onerous for the applicants, particularly high quality applicants, they might drop out of the process, right? So your most attractive applicants who have the most possibilities might drop out because it's just like, oh, this is ridiculous, this is taking frickin' forever, right? It could result in differential selection rates, reduce the number of applicants from a particular gender or ethnicity or background, and your process might seem unfair to future applicants. Current employees, the valid assessment system may favor external applicants or not give qualified employees an equal chance of applying for internal position. Employees may question its fairness. And this will take us back to the previous assignment, should I hire or should I train? And what are the pros and cons of both, right? Maybe I can use this assessment tool to find extremely well qualified external applicants, but then what damage does this do to my company and my relationship with my potential internal applicants? So again, it's always a system of trade-offs. Let's stop here because it looks like the timer is about to run out, and we'll pick up with validity generalization coming out in part 3.